So welcome, and this is the last part of the respiratory system lectures, and we've seen the air as it moves through the conducting zone, and that air was filtered, humidified, and warmed, which serves the purpose of optimal gas exchange down in the respiratory zone, where we're going to look at those microscopic anatomy that comprises the air-blood boundary where external respiration takes place. That is, bringing oxygen into the bloodstream and getting rid of carbon dioxide. So before we get to the actual respiratory exchange membrane, we're going to talk about the smallest branches of the bronchial tree, the bronchioles. So your bronchies, your bronchi turn to the bronchioles. And the important part around here is that we've lost the cartilage plates that were present in the bronchi. Right? And so what that means is they're no longer held open. They've gotten small enough so you don't really need bronchi to hold them open. Air enough will do it. But they can also be controlled. Right? That passageway now, if they constrict, right, this whole tube, strict and decrease the diameter of the airway tube right here because it's not being held open by those cartilage rings. Right? So we're in our bronchiole lined with this smooth muscle strip that when it contracts, it could decrease the diameter of the tube and decrease airflow in here. And so you got those terminal bronchioles, which don't have gas exchange, and then you get into what's called the respiratory bronchiole. And the very name respiratory means that there is some gas exchange going on there. Right, but I want to talk about these bronchioles and the smooth muscles and the lack of cartilage right here, right? So we're going from this area where you lost the cartilage. It changes, it transitions into different types of epithelia. It's small enough now so that things that have gotten caught, hopefully have gotten caught. You don't have that mucus lining so much anymore, or not any kind of thick mucus lining. And so mucociliary transport is no longer occurring. It starts to become lined with a simple columnar and goes down to some kind of simple cuboidal. Again, I don't test you on that, but eventually it'll go into simple squamous. But so you got these bronchial trees lined with this, you have blood vessels within here, and you got these strips of smooth muscle. And so what happens with asthma is that the asthma reaction causes a very acute tightening of these smooth muscles, right? Which is going to decrease the diameter here, which is going to decrease airflow in here, right? So it could, we want to contrast this with the bronchi, which are kept open by the cartilage. This is a little more vulnerable to that asthma right here. And we'll mention that again a little bit. All right, so we've gone through, we don't really care so much about the respiratory bronchioles, but they do start to have these air exchange surfaces, right? But from there, you're going to go on to what's called the alveolar ducts over here into the alveolar sacs, into the individual alveolus, right, which is the little balls you see right here. And all alongside, the blood vessels are going to be falling on, also branching off until they form what's called these capillary networks around each alveoli. So from the ducts, right, just this passageway into this ball kind of area right here, into the alveoli or individual alveolus over here. And when there's about, hundreds of millions of alveoli within your lungs, and what that's going to translate into is a lot of surface area. Right? So your skin, if you laid it out flat, would be a certain size. If you laid out all the surface area created by the alveoli, you get like 1,500 square feet, which is about half a tennis court. What that means is that there's a lot of surface area for gas exchange, right? So that's an important point about these alveoli, just like your brain folds. The brain folds within your brain were creating that extra area for information processing, right? Your microvilli was creating area for extra surface absorption, right? These folds and these little air sacs right here. The air sacs right here are creating that extra surface area over here, right? And so these alveolar sacs, and the alveolar is where the majority of gas exchange is occurring. So you could think of the alveolar sacs as these 1, 2, 3, 4, a whole bunch of alveoli, like a bunch of grapes. Each individual grape is an alveolus, right? Collectively called alveoli. And before we just to understand the structure, air is coming in through here, passing through here, a little gas exchange here, and it goes into these. Now this is, from the outside, it looks like there's a enclosed ball, but this is all open space, just with these indents like this, right? So air's got to travel in to get to here. This is all an open passageway right here, right? So that are these are the alveolar sacs, and each one of these little kind of bubbles or areas right here are the alveolus, right? But air is coming in here, and this whole area is going to be gas exchange. But this is what's creating that extra surface area, these indents of what's called the respiratory exchange surface. That's going to exchange gas with these capillaries, right? So the capillaries are there. And remember, these elastic fibers, which are running around here, when these guys expand through inhalation of air, those elastic fibers are going to store that energy and then push it back to normal size, right? So here we are, right? Trachea, bronchi, smaller branches you can't see, and all these little tiny little things over there are going to be our alveolar sacs, right? Millions, hundreds and millions of them. This is running a little over. Feel free to take off if you want. I will record it, right? So here is the lungs up here, and then you're looking very closely at these little actual alveoli, right? Very small little things. And for histology purposes, when you look at a slice, what I wanted to point out about these lungs, if you take a slice, remember the deli meat analogy, you took a slice, what you're getting is a bunch of the alveoli, you're also getting the bronchi tree, you're also getting the blood vessels. Right, so if you look at a slice like this, from your histology things, you might see a bronchiole, which would be up here. And then all around it, you're going to see these, either, it's hard to tell whether, where the alveolar sacs and the individual alveoli, I don't ask that, but that's what all these spaces are, basically something like this, right? That's what you'd be looking at in any particular slice of lung tissue sample, right? These little spaces right here. All right, so let's get into these alveolus right here, right? Air has come in, right? And it's going to want to get in, air is going to want to get in to the capillaries surrounding it right here. What do you want when you want a fast, flat, well, you want an epithelial lining that's going to be able to provide minimal kind of barrier to this diffusion, right? For the gas exchange. So when you do that, do you want a big, thick lining of multi-layers? No, you want a simple layer. Do you want a long, big, thick cell like a pseudostratified or a simple columnar? No, you want a very flat cell, right, for minimal surface area for this rapid gas exchange, right? Same will be true for the capillaries, right? So that'll be what? Simple squamous epithelia, right? Anytime where you're talking about gas exchange, that's simple squamous epithelia, right? So now we've gone in from a pseudostratified, you had a transition into that, which we don't care about so much, but now we're into our simple squamous epithelia, the other really important kind of epithelia, right? Because this is where all the gas exchange is going to occur. All right, but before we get into the actual gas exchange, I want to mention two types of cells in here that are important, and some of the pathologies and functions of these are going to happen, right? Number one, you have these purple ones over here. These are basically macrophages, that is cells that go around and eat like debris and pathogens and stuff like that, that have actually entered the little alveolar tract over here, right? So these are immune cells. Do that, right? So here are these macrophages. Inside here, little things have gotten in. Maybe they're coronaviruses, maybe they're influenza viruses, maybe they're asbestos, right? Little things that could actually get through, all the trappings of the upper respiratory tract, and your bronchi tree can make it in through this area into this delicate lining, right? So these macrophages kick into action and start gobbling up whatever they can see, as well as calling in the immune system to tell them if we have a breach, right? A pathogen attack right here, right? So what I mentioned here was insoluble particles, things like asbestos or very fine wood particles if you work in a wood shop. Once these macrophages start eating those, they're not digestible. And so that causes a reaction, another immune reaction, right? Which is why asbestos is so damaging, because these guys get sick and then they cause all sorts of other problems with very small particles. And the other thing is when you get that kind of damage from the macrophages or an immune response, you also get from the surrounding tissue, you get that immune response, and then you have to have a subsequent repair, right? Remodeling, regeneration of all that, which often results in this fibrosis or buildup of scar tissue. And we'll see why that's a particular problem, in certain areas of the lungs right here. But this is one effect of having a very bad lung infection. And, COVID is one of those things that can cause a very bad lung infection. So that is your macrophages, right? And related to the immune response. The other types of cells in here are also important in other diseases. These are called surfactant cells or type 2 cells. These are the actual cells that express high levels of those ACE2 receptors. So these are a point of infection for SARS-2. The endothelial cells also are highly expressing those ACE2 receptors. So these cells in here, we'll remember, or not, that every cell in your body, those amoebas and everything, they were lined. They had to be existing in some kind of aqueous layer, right? For gas exchange to occur. So cells always need to be in some kind of aqueous layer. The problem with this very small, delicate area being lined with this necessary aqueous medium is that if these two ever meet, they'll stick together, right? Those little balls or little alveoli, when you breathe out and they collapse, they'll stick together because of the surface tension of water. And so what those surfactant cells do is produce a detergent-like molecule, right, within the fluid layer right here, which is going to reduce the surface tension, right? Kind of like soap bubbles in here that are going to kind of prevent that stickiness of these layers to each other, right? So this is going to prevent alveolar collapse, right? So if you had problems producing surfactant, then you would have problems with this, whole area of breathing, right? Or if you were a premature baby who hasn't started producing those, you'd also have problems, as we'll see when we get to some of the pathologies of this. But that's surfactant cells, type 2 alveolar cells that produce that surfactant. This is just another picture, right? There's the surfactant within the aqueous layer, and they're repulsing the aqueous layer, so that keeps that open. Main point being, I asked in the learning objectives, name 2 adaptations that ensure airways remain open. First one was that tracheal rings, the cartilage rings and cartilage plates. And then the other one that was keeping the airway open was this surfactant, right? Preventing that alveolar collapse. All right, we're getting there. We're getting there. Here's the bottom line. Here are these simple squamous cells, the type 1 cells, and where this is where the gas diffusion is going to occur right here, right? So this is where your respiratory exchange membrane is occurring, not to be confused with the respiratory epithelium, which is refers to as that pseudostratified stuff, right? Which is up there. This is where the respiratory exchange membrane is. And so the membrane right here, you have the simple squamous cells. You have the endothelial cells of the blind right here. And this really all together is what is kind of referred to as that respiratory exchange membrane, right? Where these two connect. What you have is a kind of minimal interface, minimal interstitium, as we say, between these two surfaces and allow fast gas exchange, right? So let's take a little closer look real quick at what this looks like. And so here's your oxygen within here. It's going to diffuse through because it's a lipid soluble gas, goes through the cell membrane of the squamous cell, and then through this interstitial space right here, which is minimal, usually only consists of what's called the shared basement membrane, and then into the bloodstream right there. All right, so here is the air space. And here's the oxygen. It's going to go through the cell membrane of the type 1 epithelial cell, type 1 squamous cells, alveolar cell. It's going to pass through the other side into the minimal interstitial space because of this fused basal lamina. Then it's going to diffuse through your endothelial lining of the blood vessel and then into the blood itself. Right? From there, and because it's not very soluble in the fluid, it'll go diffuse into the red blood cell where it's going to bind to hemoglobin, right? And then CO2 is going to do the same thing in the opposite direction, right? But the main point here is this area, super small, the smallest it could possibly be, to allow this rapid gas exchange of these lipid soluble molecules. Right? There's no nutrient exchange really going on like you might see in other tissues. So it's only gas which diffuses very rapidly, and there's a minimal space. And it's all going to be based on concentration gradients, right? More oxygen in here means oxygen diffuses in here. More carbon dioxide here means carbon dioxide fuses out. Again, that's something you can learn when you get to physiology. All right, so here we are, and this showing this infection of the lungs of the actual alveoli, right? So they're showing a blow up of an individual alveolus here. And tiny little blue things here is the virus. It's been infected. The immune system has been called in. Right? All these immune cells are coming in, and what their job is to destroy the infected cells, right? Which are going to be the lining of the wall, right? This is going to cause more damage around it if there's a breach. Here now the virus can actually get into the bloodstream, right? Once they're in the bloodstream, they have access to the entire body. They can go to any tissue in the body, right? So you get this bad immune reaction, and now all of a sudden it's not just a respiratory disease anymore. And again, this is true for any bad sort of virus infection, right? It's the same is true for the flu. What is happening with other systemic sort of diseases with coronavirus is, largely just, looking really closely at it and seeing what happens. There's maybe some peculiarities, but we won't really know. And I think for a little while until it all gets sorted out. But in any case, the virus is causing this immune reaction, causing a breakdown of the outer wall right here, right? And so what's going to happen with the breakdown? You got to repair it. Right over here, all this damage is happening within, your lung tissue, basically, right? All sorts of damage to the blood vessels, as well as the alveolar lining here. And so again, this is that picture showing an infection in these certain segments of the lung, right, where something is not nice, like you see up here, right? These different segments have been infected. This is pneumonia. Maybe this is other inflammation that's going on right here in these particular areas. Right? But you can see the branches of those bronchi trees, and this would be all that, the finer branches right here with problems in it. So one of the big things besides fluid buildup is that scarring, right? So normally you have this small distance over here and the, watery kind of loose connective tissue, or hardly any at all, right? Just that shared basement membrane that allows for fast gas exchange. When you start to get that scarring effect, right, this fibrosis, pulmonary fibrosis, you start to get an increase in the space, to where the oxygen actually has to pass through, right? So your breathing becomes much more inefficient. Basically, that rapid gas exchange has been, its function has been compromised because of the scarred lung tissue. And so this is one of the main problems with a lot of pulmonary diseases. Smoking causes this, fibrosis, other sorts of infections cause this. Right? But that's one of the main problems is slow down, decreased function in gas exchange. All right, so smoking is one of those things, and just, because there are other diseases in the world besides coronavirus, I want to mention smoking. And what are some of the effects right here, right? One of them, right, terminal bronchioles, where you had that, there's some kind of effect, right, where the constriction of the airway passage, nicotine itself is causing that. Carbon dioxide within the smoke is going to bind to hemoglobin once it's in the bloodstream and reduce oxygen carrying capacity. There's also all sorts of irritants in the smoke, which is going to increase mucus obstruction, increase the inflammation response, which is going to decrease the diameter of those blood fruits. Also, in the cilia, right, with that mucociliary transport is hampered because the cilia has been paralyzed and they've been destroyed. So you're not clearing your lungs out, right? That's why they have that all that nasty phlegm when they cough up stuff, right? This is all fun stuff. And I smoked for, good 15 years. So I had all that stuff. Long-term use is going to allow to a much greater increase in breakdown of elastic fibers beyond age and collapse and emphysema, right? Which is basically what we'll talk about with the breakdown of alveolar walls right there, along with the fibers that are around them, right? The elastic fibers. So one thing, bronchitis happens in the bronchi, inflammation of the bronchial wall, right? You're gonna have that epithelial, you'll have a little bit of smooth muscle. You'll also have, the membrane here, which is kind of inflamed, mucus production, decrease the diameter of your airway, right? With things like asthma, you might have that narrowing of passageway, but you also get, because these bronchioles are not protected by the cartilage, right? These tightened, smooth muscles right around here, that's just a parasympathetic response right there. That's going to further close these, a very acute response, causing this really dangerous blockage of air into those, right? Into the bronchioles. So I want to mention asthma, kind of associated more with this bronchioles because of the lack of protection with lack of cartilage right there. And the other mention, once we get into the alveolar, I want to mention this respiratory distress syndrome, right? This happens with premature babies that are born early. And then what the problem here is that these babies cannot produce surfactant, right? They have the genes, but they're not really ready, normally produced at this point. So what happens if you're not producing surfactant? When they breathe out, these airways, those alveoli stick together, right? And basically they remain collapsed, right? And so they've got to be force-fed oxygen in here to keep these open right here, right? So there's a big major factor in, premature babies, right? Dying. A third of all deaths are due to this respiratory distress syndrome, due to the inability of them to produce surfactant from those type 2 alveolar cells. All right. And then the other, that's, that wasn't related to COPD, but that's one of the diseases. The other main one is emphysema. Right? It's a big major factor, right? So in this case, it happens, you start getting it, it gets worse. And these alveolar walls, right? That simple squamous epithelial cells are broken down, right? What does that result in? All that 1,500 square feet starts to become progressively less and less surface area for gas exchange, right? If those are happening, the elastic fiber breakdown is going to mean that exhalation is going to take energy. You have to do that forced breathing. If you heard someone with emphysema, they have that sound, right? They have to force the air out because that elastic fiber is this weakened kind of stringy bungee cord type of action, right? So smokers obviously are going to have it. So here's another picture. Here's a healthy one with X amount of surface area. And here is 1 over X surface area, because now the gas coming in here has only so much surface area to exchange gas, emphysema, right? So if I showed you a histology slice on a test, for instance, with a nice alveolar sac over here with all these nice little indents in here, and then I showed you a tissue sample with these big, wide open spaces, you can kind of guess they have this emphysema, right? A destruction of the alveolar walls right there. And here's another picture. This is a scanning electron microscope of the normal, right? Lots of gas exchange, not so much, right? Emphysema. All right. And so also related to reduced surface area is this buildup of fluid due to this inflammatory response due to whatever kind of infection, right? Pneumonia. So many COVID patients die of pneumonia, but of course pneumonia doesn't come from nowhere. It's caused by the infection, right? So when you get pneumonia, right, your air sacs become fluid. It becomes filled with this fluid, right? Again, less area for gas exchange versus this, right? So all of these types of diseases, right, happening in particular areas of there, right? You know, what are they going to cause? Are they going to cause restricted airway passage? Are they going to cause, restricted gas exchange surface area, right? Are they just going to destroy maybe the capillaries and stuff in there like cancer does? We don't really talk about cancer here, but all of these are going to be related to kind of particular areas, and you want to kind of have a guess of what's going on about the air movement through here. Is it just moving through? Is it being filtered? Or is there gas exchange going on right there? What might happen if there's damage to any of these particular areas, right? So that is it, right? You've gone to the basic function, gas exchange, right? Air coming in to these little air sacs, going through the alveolar walls into the capillaries, right? So next time we'll talk about this whole blood circuitry going through here and through the body tissues. But that would be it for our respiratory lecture. So bringing oxygen into the blood is that external respiration process. And then the next process we're going to be talking about here is how the cardiovascular system is going to take that oxygenated blood, and the heart will pump it out to all your oxygen-starved tissues of the body. All right, we'll see you then. Bye.